Let's bow our heads and we will begin. Our Father in heaven, we just thank you for the blessedness of the Sabbath. We want to gain as much spiritual food as we can, and because you are providing more of your Spirit, because we are hungry for your Spirit and we know that we are poor in spirit, we want to receive all that we can. So help us, Father, as we open this session, that we will be drawn closer to you and rest in that assurance that we are your children and that we will become part of the family in heaven as an extension through the joy that we feel here. In Jesus' name. Amen. So before we do begin, I have this little booklet here. It's not so little anymore, it's 56 pages now. Time to Commence the Sabbath. This has gone through three developments. Originally, we looked at the subject of the dawn Sabbath. Some people approached us and said, well, the Sabbath begins at dawn, providing a number of texts along those lines. So we said, okay, we'll have a look at this. And as is my practice, the first thing that I do, of course, is go to the Bible. And I also go back to our pioneers to study what the pioneers said. And if they have made a mistake, to find that mistake that they've made as I'm reading the scripture and to work it forward. And so when I went back and I read Jane Andrews' pamphlet, I thought, that's pretty good stuff. I thought that was pretty good. So all of Jane Andrews' pamphlet from 1855 is in this document, listing out his reasoning for the Sabbath being kept on the seventh day from sunset to sunset. And it addresses a number of aspects in here. I found this a wonderful study because, of course, if you have a dawn Sabbath, then the daylight is first and the darkness is second. And I talk about this in here about that goes completely opposite to the two covenants. Because in the two covenants, the ministration of death is first and then resurrection and life is second. And so that was one of many issues where I could see, and the fact that this world is dark, and when we go to heaven on the new earth, it'll only be light. There's no more night. So there's the end of night, so we don't want the Sabbath ending in night, it wants to end in day. So that's just some of the many reasons, apart from the fact that Ellen White was shown in 1847 that the Sabbath commencing at sunrise is wrong. And they would say, well, it's not sunrise, it's dawn. But and the other thing is, well, it wasn't Ellen White that said it was James White that said it, and we can't trust James White. Well, I would trust James White over anybody today, any day of the week. That's just my bias. So if you're going to have a bias, that's the one I've got. All right. So, but I've also we've had some information. There's been a lot of talk about the lunar Sabbath, and that is that the Sabbath begins with a new moon, and you start counting 7-day cycles from the new moon. And again, I'm willing to look at this. I looked at it openly, candidly. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've missed something, and I've looked at it fairly candidly. And I've put in here a few basic principles of why the lunar Sabbath cannot be true. And one of them, of course, is the manna that came. And Ellen White, I've got the quotes in here where it says that up to the Friday they had the double portion of the manna, and Saturday there was a Sabbath. So again, if you accept the spirit of prophecy, it's not too difficult. It's quite easy. And in Patriarchs and Prophets, it talks about the literal week. In the very first paragraph in Patriarchs and Prophets, it talks about the fact that the 7-day week is a continuous, unbroken cycle. And if we are to remember the Sabbath day, because in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the reason we keep this day is because we are memorializing the 6 days in which God created the earth. That's fairly basic. It's fairly straightforward. There are other arguments as well, like the calculation for Pentecost. In order to get 50 days, you have to count 7 Sabbaths, and they have to be 7 sevens, and the following day, the 50th day. The only way you can get 50 days is with a 7-day cycle of Sabbaths. If you follow the other system, it doesn't work. It's 51, 52 days, and it blows that whole system out. So just on the basis of that alone, and there's another number of other arguments in terms of the date line, and I might just read you one quote from this. I've also got a quote in here where it references the Waldenses who kept the Sabbath from sundown to sundown. That's a handy little, the 7th day from sundown to sundown, that's handy information as well. And this is what she says. All those, this is on page 47. Anybody else want a copy?
Yes, please.
Got a few there. I've got a few copies. Oh, got another copy.
Thank you.
We've run out, have we? Sorry about that. On page 47, there's a Spirit of Prophecy quote in Selected Messages, Volume 3, down 2/3 of the way down the page. All those who hold the beginning of their confidence firm unto the end will keep the 7th-day Sabbath, which comes to us as marked by the sun. There's no reference to the moon. So it's the sun that is the marker point. That's in Selected Messages, Volume 3, page 318. Many people make reference to the Gregorian calendar. That Saturday is part of the Gregorian calendar. But the 7-day cycle has nothing to do with any calendar. It's just a 7-day cycle, and you can put that 7-day cycle into whatever calendar you want to put it into. Julian, Gregorian, it doesn't matter. Cariite, doesn't, sorry?
Evens.
Yeah. Evens calendar, you can put it in that one too. So,
Do you know what cultures like the Chinese or something, do they have, because they wouldn't have been Gregorian, they would have been their own sort of...
yeah, the Chinese would have a different calendar, of course they do.
They would have had sevens in there as well.
I
You just don't know about that.
I haven't studied too deeply into it. There was a chart that the Adventists used to put out, the 7-day week in 160 cultures. I think I've got it on the website actually, where it shows the 7-day week and the 7th day as a Sabbath in 108 of 160 cultures. The 7th day of the week is referred to as a Sabbath. In those cultures, yeah, in that language. Which again, 160 cultures. It's quite interesting that's the way it is. The quote at the bottom of that page is quite interesting. We might just read that. God rested on the 7th day and set it apart for man to observe in honour of his creation of the heavens and the earth in 6 literal days. That's the purpose, one of the key purposes of the Sabbath. He blessed and sanctified and made holy the day of rest. When men are so careful as to search and to dig, to see in regard to the precise period of time, we are to say, God made his Sabbath for a round world. And when the 7th day comes to us in that round world, controlled by the sun that rules the day, it is the time in all countries and lands to observe the Sabbath. So when the Sabbath comes to us, which means that it's sunset to sunset in the location where you are dwelling. The Sabbath is ruled by the sun. It is not connected to the moon. It's when the sun comes to you. It's fairly clear. And it says, and as I've got further down, the Lord accepts all the obedience of every creature he has made according to the circumstances of time in the sun rising and sun setting worlds. Okay, so talking about sun rising and sunset. And there's a statement which the next section she talks to someone where she says, we know where we stand. I think it's the bottom of page 48. Is it possible that so much importance can be clustered about those who observe the Sabbath, and yet no one can tell when the Sabbath comes? Then she says, then where is the people who bear the badge of the sign of God? What is the sign? The seventh day Sabbath, which the Lord blessed and sanctified and pronounced holy with great penalties for its violation. She says here, the seventh day Sabbath is in no uncertainty. So the Spirit of Prophecy tells us there is no uncertainty about this question. She's not saying there's more light to come on this in terms of the timing of the Sabbath. She's saying we know when it is. It is the seventh day of the week, and it is from sunset to sunset in the location where you are dwelling. And if you happen to be living up in Norway, that's when you can keep records, she says. And this was one of the reasons why Joseph Bates recommended the 6 p.m. to 6 p.m, because he had been right up in the north and he realised that, well, it's going to be difficult for them up there, so he suggested 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. But that's only a problem if the sun never goes down. And say if you're living like when I've visited somewhere like Germany in summer, you can have a 16-hour Sabbath. It's great.
Wow, hallelujah.
But it's all compensatory, because in winter it's a lot shorter. It's a lot shorter. So this is going to become, I think this is an important document in terms of, because there's a lot of people pressing on a number of issues on this, and this is my culmination as for when the time to commence the Sabbath takes place. So, and I've tried to be candid to address every person that's come with a question. I've tried to answer it, and I don't follow the Gregorian calendar. No, I'm not interested in that. I follow my Father's calendar. So, to walk in my Father's ways, let's have a bit of a look at this. Has everyone got a copy? Got 2 copies left. I brought a bunch of them.
Harry?
I did bring a bunch of them.
I've got one. It's a secure one.
You haven't got one?
Yeah.
You've got plenty. You've got on your computer. You've got plenty.
For those who've got phones, you can go onto the website and you can download. Oh, you got a spare copy?
Yep, spare copy. Who wants that?
Where
No one else needs it.
You can go online and look up the PDF if you've got it on the website.
Good.
So, on Thursday, my wife and I celebrated our anniversary. Thank you. 26 years? 26? So, and we're just sort of going over some of our history. And we're just talking about some of the challenges, and I asked her, over the changes that have taken place, what has been the most difficult? And what did you say? The feast. The feasts have been the most difficult.
At first it was a case of, I'm easy to that, but I think I was just,
So for those online, Laurel just said, when I first got interested in the feast, Laurel said, well, you can do that, but
I wasn't that interested. That's
she wasn't that interested. But I will say, at least she didn't grab the frying pan and try and beat me over the head with it and say, no, you're not going to do this, which is a blessing. So,
But then, remember what I did say when we had our first Passover at Widgie, and just the beautiful time that we had, I thought, well, if this is what it's all about, I'm in.
okay, taste and see that the feasts are good.
What did I say? If this is what legalism, well, I'll be a legalist.
If this is legalism, I want more of it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, it is interesting that in our journey that I suppose, what's the word? In terms of the cringe factor, for me, the feasts were the hardest to deal with. The father and son was just obvious, it made sense, our pioneers believed it. Once the evidence was there, it was pretty clear where the truth lay on that particular question. I've often puzzled why the Lord led me in the direction in regard to the feasts. Why that next? And this is where I see great wisdom, because following the divine pattern, and I'll bring the board over. Sorry for those online, but I know I've been told, sorry Glenn, whiteboard, it should be a blackboard. This was my thinking at the time. The principle of source and channel. I just began to think about all aspects of my life in terms of the way I came into life. Parents, father source, mother channel, the 10 Commandments, love to God, love to man, tithing, first tithe, second tithe. And then I began to think about the Sabbath. Thought about the Sabbath in terms of, the source and the channel, and it made sense to me. My acceptance. Okay.
It looks better without the chair.
Right. Okay. So one of the key reasons why I came into the feasts was a convergence of two ideas. And it was an idea that we started in Eden's Landing with the blessing principle. You are my beloved child in whom I am well pleased. And the question that went with that, and that is, when is it the best time to pour out this blessing? Well, any time is a good time to pour out that blessing, isn't it? But could it make a difference as to when you would pour this out? And I became very intrigued by this idea, and I wanted to test the idea myself in terms of if there is a magnification in the channel, source and channel, and the feasts are indeed a magnification of the Sabbath, then the blessing during a feast, a Sabbath during a feast, would yield a greater blessing. And so I tested that. I tested that idea when we were in Georgia and Talking Rock in 2013. We tested that idea, and the Lord made it abundantly clear that there is indeed a divine pattern principle here. And so,
How to test it?
huh?
How to test it?
We invited people to come forward, and this was the Sabbath during the Feast of Tabernacles. So it was Sabbath on Sabbath. I thought, okay, and I thought to myself, all right, what I'm going to do is I'll because I didn't want to manufacture anything and sort of build it up and whip it up. So I just said, okay, well I'll invite some of the young men to come forward and we'll see what happens. As I stood up, and I looked out into the audience and I had explained about the principle of the blessing, I could see the people in the audience like they were like willing me to bring them forward. There's just this look everyone had, and I was like, and everything changed. The whole plan I had went out the window, and I said, I'd like to invite all the elders, and you know who you are. I said, those who've served as elders in their churches, come forward. And they came forward, and I said, all those who would like to receive a blessing. We had 100 people in that hall that day. 90 of them came forward. And for the next 2 hours, we just spoke the love of God over people, and the joy, the freedom, the tears, the laughter. It was just such a blessed experience, such a joyful experience. And so we say, well, okay, you're basing everything on feelings, right? So, well, a lot of homework had been done biblically in terms of the whole process and how it was set up, everything like that. But I kept testing it. I kept testing it over the next 2 years. I kept working on this idea. And so that's when I came back, and some of my friends said, oh, you've gone soft in the head, Adrian. All your American friends have twisted your brain, and you've gone a bit loopy, and now you're into this feast nonsense. And that's, I just have to put up with this nonsense that you're into now. If it wasn't for Di, who pulled me aside and said, Adrian, please tell me about the feast, because I didn't want to talk about it. I was kind of like this leper feast keeper, just like no, I don't want to talk about it. Because I was still uneasy about about the feasts, and as I said, I had to coin my own term to get used to it. I called myself a feast receiver because the word feast keeper, just I didn't like that word. It was just too legalistic for me. It was feast means legalism, right?
Like Sabbath keeper.
Like Sabbath keeper. Interesting you should say that. Interesting you should say that, huh? And so we see that the same arguments, same attitudes that the Protestant churches manifest towards Sabbath keepers manifest towards feast keepers. It's the same arguments, same attitudes, same approach. Interesting. Very, very interesting. And so when we did our first tabernacles here, and everyone could feel it. They could feel the difference. I thought, and I wasn't putting it on anyone. It was, well, we need to do this again. This is really, really good. So, and we laid out all the biblical basis for it. So anyway, that's a bit of an introduction into the statutes and the judgments. So let's come to page 4 of this booklet. And we'll ask ourselves some questions. This is David. The final words of David to Solomon. 1 Kings 2 verse 3. And keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his judgments and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that thou mayest prosper in all that thou doest, and whithersoever thou turnest thyself. These are the closing words of David to his son, saying, if you want to prosper, if you want to be blessed, then keep the statutes and the judgments and the testimonies. Okay? Now, that seems very opposite to the idea of a yoke of bondage, doesn't it? He's saying this is your wisdom, this is your blessing, and David is speaking to his son Solomon. And we see here, we'll just read this paragraph below that where it says, the above words were King David's dying charge to Solomon, his son, as stated 2 verses before in 1 Kings 2:1. Now the days of David drew nigh that he would die, and he charged Solomon his son. David knew how great the fall of a kingdom could be due to its king. He had seen it in the life of Saul and in his own life and his dealings with Absalom. A life of learning had led him to understand that the prosperity of the kingdom, the church of its time, relied on the leaders walking in God's ways, which is to keep God's statutes, commandments, judgments, and testimonies, as is written in the law of Moses. Now, it's interesting what Ellen White says here. We'll just read a couple of quotes. It says, David knew that God's high purpose for Israel could be met only as rulers and kings should seek with unceasing vigilance to attain to the standard placed before them. He knew that in order for his son Solomon to fulfill the trust with which God was pleased to honour him, sorry Craig, I'll get back to that one. The youthful ruler must be not merely a warrior, a statesman and a sovereign, but a strong, good man, a teacher of righteousness, an example of fidelity. That's in Prophets and Kings, page 26. And so what's interesting in this next passage is, actually I need to come over to page 6. I think this is where it's, or did I missed something here. Okay, no, it is the next paragraph. Since Craig has messaged me, I'm like,
Yeah, it's worth reading.
I've got to read it.
You will. I've got it.
Could you?
Okay, Ezra 3:1-6. Before laying the foundation of the temple, they kept the Feast of Tabernacles. Before a spiritual temple can be built, need to keep tabernacles.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So if we want to build Ezekiel's temple, we have to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. That's a good point. So, so what we read in 1 Kings is directly stated by the Bible as David's last words to Solomon, but are there any other words stated to Solomon before he died? And so we now read Prophets and Kings 26 again. With tender earnestness, David entreated Solomon to be manly and noble, to show mercy and loving kindness to his subjects, and in all his dealings with the nations of earth, to honour and glorify the name of God, and to make manifest the beauty of holiness. The many trying and remarkable experiences through which David had passed during his lifetime had taught him the value of the nobler virtues and led him to declare in his dying charge to Solomon, "He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God, and he shall be as the light of the morning when the sun riseth, even as morning without clouds, as the tender grass springing out of the earth by clear shining after the rain." And then she's got 2 Samuel 23, verses 3 and 4. This is interesting, that, and we'll just read the next paragraph. Ellen White does say something interesting in this passage from Prophets and Kings. She talks of David's dying charge to Solomon, and then you would expect her to quote 1 Kings 2, but she doesn't. She instead quotes 2 Samuel 23, which the Bible does not say was spoken directly to Solomon. It just says that now these be the last words of David. Ellen White takes this passage and says this was said to Solomon, meaning 2 Samuel 23, 1-7, and 1 Kings 2, 1-10 should be taken together as the complete dying charge to Solomon. So I found that very interesting. So when we now let's have a look at 2 Samuel 23. And I want you to notice, see if you can pick it up. 2 Samuel 23. And we've just read verse 3 and 4 about the rain. And maybe someone in a loud voice can read verse 5.
Although my house not be so with God, yet he hath made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and sure, for this is all my salvation and all my desire, although he make it not to grow.
So what's interesting is in these two passages, in 1 Kings chapter 2, there's an admonition to keep the statutes and the judgments and everything written in the law of Moses. Okay? Now, when you bring 2 Samuel 23, it introduces the everlasting covenant. So in 2 Samuel 23 is given to us the ability to fulfill the command in 1 Kings chapter 2. Does that make sense? Because he's saying keep the statutes and the judgments, but how are you going to keep the statutes and the judgments? That would be sheer legalism unless you had an understanding of the everlasting covenant. And this here, Ellen White, connecting the two together, this is one of the profound things that Pastor Cecil mentioned in this book, was it's the two connected together, showing the everlasting covenant, which allows you to fulfill the command to keep the statutes and the judgments and all of those things. So if you were to command this without having the everlasting covenant, you are actually doing something that's going to damage. And why is this so important? Well, this is important for Adventism because we have this question that is laid out. And many people say this, well, you say that you should keep the feast. Well, Ellen White didn't keep the feast. So why are you keeping the feast? It's a fair question, isn't it? So we have this issue of the combining of the everlasting covenant with the commands to keep the statutes and the judgments. Okay? So, did the Seventh-day Adventist Church accept the everlasting covenant?
No,
No.
it was rejected in
It
1888.
was rejected in 1888. So, God was bringing the Adventist Church up to the point to bringing them out of Augustinian concepts of covenant understanding and the law, and was moving them step by step to be able to receive the covenants in a correct manner. If they had have accepted the everlasting covenant, then they could have accepted the statements to keep the statutes and the judgments written in the law of Moses. Now, as it turns out, Ellen White did make some very interesting statements about the law of Moses, and I want to have a look in the booklet. The next chapter.
And just quickly go back to 2 Samuel 23:23. He picks it up at
23:1 to 7.
so 23, but verse 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
The words leading into it, because they're not in this quote. The God of Israel said, "The Rock of Israel spake to me." We've got a divine pattern coming on here. God of Israel, Father. Rock of Israel,
Yeah.
His Son.
Yeah.
So it's very significant where these words have come from.
The divine pattern
Yeah,
following through. Yeah. That source channel.
yeah.
Yeah. And I think this is very significant for us, because in order to come into all of the statutes and the judgments, you had to have an understanding of the everlasting covenant. And with this point, I'd like to jump over to page 21, and we'll look at some quotes that, when I read these in 2014, I thought, whoa, that's pretty intense. So, page 21, the word of Moses is the word of God to us. That's the section. And we look at the first quote, where it says, Signs of the Times. This is in 1895. The timing is interesting. The words of Moses to Israel concerning the statutes and the judgments of the Lord are also the word of God to us. Is that plain? Everyone's speechless or asleep.
It's fine.
It's very plain, isn't it?
Yep.
And notice the timing, at least in this verse, 1895, after the 1888 message had been given, the everlasting covenant. I remember the first time I read that, I was like, what? The words of Moses to Israel concerning the statutes and the judgments of the Lord are also the word of God to us.
And remembering, after 1888, Ellen White, Wagner Jones and some others were preaching the third angel's message, and the latter rain in some places was beginning to fall.
Yes, it was beginning to fall.
So in that context,
it could come forward. So here, now here's, no, that's not the one. The next one, I'm not sure when this is, but the next quote under that. The instructions given to Moses for ancient Israel with their sharp, rigid outlines are to be studied and obeyed by the people of God today. I love the way she writes. Sharp, rigid. Are to be studied and obeyed. It's just got that twang to it, doesn't it?
It's interesting that in a painting, a picture that you hang on the wall, where the framework is often sharp and rigid at the corners, but the picture itself can be very soft once you get into the centre of it.
It's very nice, Gavin. That's very, very nice. A sharp, rigid barrier, but the picture is very, very nice.
it says outlines.
Yeah, outlines, there you go.
That's what Gav's saying.
Yeah, outline the frame, the ministration of death. I mean, what do we do with statements like this? And if you notice, Leviticus 23, does it refer to the feast as statutes? Well, it does. It does. It refers to them as statutes. Are they to be studied and obeyed by the children of God today? All right, next quote. Moses, the visible leader of the Israelites, was admitted into the secret councils of the Most High, the people were given evidence that Moses did indeed talk with God, receiving from him the instruction given them. And that was in 1903. So I find that amazing. That's so clearly outlined here. But why is it that people have such a resistance to the festivals? Well, let me ask you another question. Why is it that Sunday keepers have such resistance to the Sabbath?
It's not popular.
Well, one, it's not popular.
It's not their truth.
It's not their truth. One of the other reasons is Sabbath keepers themselves are the main reason why you shouldn't keep Sabbath. Because where is the joy? Where is the, it's all rules. And of course, the way that other churches portray this, they will overstate their case to say that it's legalism and everything like that. But there is some measure of truth. And I definitely know that in the generation previous to mine, there was a very strong emphasis on doing and having your boots polished and being ready on Friday afternoon, and there was a very legalistic element to the Sabbath, wasn't there? That started to subside a little bit by my generation, but it was still a little bit rigid. Yeah?
Did you finish your thought?
1903, by the way.
No, I was 1903. Thank you.
Letter 259.
Deal.
Yeah. Gavin?
Yeah, I was just thinking the Sabbath was to be a sign to the children of Israel that I am the Lord God that sanctify them, that I am the Lord God that led you out of Egypt, etc., etc. So the Sabbath was a sign or a token. Be the same as looking at that sharp and rigid framework only. That's the sign or the framework around the meat of the picture.
Yes.
So if we're not looking at the God of creation, the God of sanctification and his beautiful character and everything that the cross that we looked at this morning, if we're not looking at the picture but only at the framework, yeah, who'd want to? You don't go to an art gallery to look at all the frames. Like maybe some do, I don't know, sorry. But you don't.
And have you seen the picture that you can look at?
Why?
And the picture is such that you look at it one way, it's a beautiful young lady, and the other one, it's an old woman.
Yeah.
And
Whoa.
if people have a view of God that's if people have a view of God as violent or tyrannical or punishing in nature, what picture do they see in the Sabbath?
Thou shalt keep the Sabbath day, or thou shalt surely die.
Yeah, I'll make your life a misery.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you have a different picture of God, the whole Sabbath changes, and the sharp, rigid outline. Remember, around Mount Sinai, put boundaries, and anyone who crosses that boundary will be shot through.
One can.
This is, and we've looked at all of that kind of understanding. So the reason that the festivals in the divine pattern sequence, they are a magnification of what you understand the Sabbath to be. So if you're screaming out that the feasts are legalism, then you are mirroring to the world that you believe your Sabbath experience is legalistic. That's all you're telling the world. My Sabbath experience is legalistic. My aversion to the feast is betraying me. Okay? Now, there are other people who love the feasts because they love the legalism of the Sabbath. And this is why the greatest argument against feast keeping is feast keepers. Because when you look at it, most times, it's like, well, when you do it right and you get and you have the Seder meal and you wear the tzitzit and you do this and you do that and you do this and we do this and this and this and you do all these things, then you're doing it right and then God's pleased with you. That's not feast keeping. That is something else. And most people in their exposure to feast keeping, that's what they see and that's what they go, no, I don't think so. So that's why when we were able to have our feast and we were able to demonstrate what my understanding of it was. Oh, is that what you're talking about?
Oh, that's all right then. like that.
Could I just hop in through what I was just saying before? It would be like having a frame around the picture and then going, no, but you've got 7 more frames to put around that frame yet.
Frame the frames.
And the last one will be like razor sharp. So, so yes. So the problem that Adventism had is that without accepting the everlasting covenant, if the subject of the feast had been introduced to Adventism without understanding righteousness by faith, what would be the result? It would be very bad. So God could not lead it in that, allow it, or open up that direction because of a wrong understanding, because of the rejection of the 1888 message. I've got on page 24 the unleavened bread, Pentecost Day of Atonement tabernacles, where it all mentions that they are statutes forever. So these are statutes, clearly being talked about. And on page 25, I just want to read you a couple of statements. So it says, what does the Spirit of Prophecy say about this, about the feasts? Because Ellen White did talk about them. She says here, again, the people were reminded of the sacred obligation of the Sabbath. How were they reminded of the sacred obligation of the Sabbath? Yearly feasts were appointed at which the men of the nation were to assemble before the Lord, bringing to him their offerings of gratitude and the first fruits of his bounties. The object of all these regulations was stated. They proceeded from no exercise of mere arbitrary sovereignty. All were given for the good of Israel. Does that sound like something moral or ceremonial? It sounds like moral, doesn't it? An expansion. It's pointing you to the Sabbath. The sacredness of the Sabbath is actually being magnified in the festivals. And so she is giving that. I remember when I read that statement, and I just thought, wow, look at that. There is a connection between the Sabbath and the feasts that is being outlined there. Now, look at this on Special Testimonies on Education, the next quote. Shall we not keep holy festivals unto God? That's an interesting statement, isn't it? Shall we not show that we have some enthusiasm in his service? With the grand ennobling theme of salvation before us, shall we be as cold as statues of marble? If men can become so excited over a match game of cricket, no comment, or a horse race, or over foolish things that bring no good to anyone. Was she referring to all of those things? Shall we be unmoved when the plan of salvation is unfolded before us? Let the school and the church henceforth have festivals of rejoicing unto the Lord. So what is that telling you? That the principle of a festival, she's supporting this principle. And it should be of rejoicing, which were the festivals were designed. And we look at page 26, the top of the page. The forces of the enemies are strengthening, and as our people were and as a people we are misrepresented. But shall we not gather our forces together and come up to the Feast of Tabernacles? Let us not treat this matter as one of little importance. So here we see the principle of a Feast of Tabernacles being spoken to by Ellen White. And in Australia, yes. That's where it was talking about it there. But she never came to the place of specifying a calendar. And why was that? Well, because we didn't accept the message of righteousness by faith. So if we had specified an actual calendar,
Couldn't receive it.
it wouldn't have been able to be received in the correct framework. And so the rest of this booklet talks about how the lost was found. And, how the lost law was found, yes. Now, I did do a presentation on this, and I won't go into all all the detail here. We can read this, the Ellen White quote. Let's read this quote. It says here, like unto Josiah was there no king before him that turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses. Neither after him arose there any like him. Notwithstanding, the Lord turned not from the fierceness of his wrath, which is allowing them to receive the consequences of their own choices, because of the provocations that Manasseh had provoked him withal. The time was rapidly approaching when Jerusalem was to be utterly destroyed and the inhabitants of the land carried captive to Babylon, there to learn the lessons they had refused to learn under circumstances more favourable. Now this is Review and Herald, July 29, 1915. And I made this point once before, and I talk about this in here, that the last articles that were put into the Review and Herald by Ellen White before she died was on the subject of the finding of the book of the law. Is there something that God is trying to tell us by the fact that this was the last thing written in the Review and Herald by Ellen White was related to the finding of the statute book of the law of Moses? Is that significant?
Seems to be.
I would suggest it is. That
it's no coincidence of God.
That the fact is that we cannot find the book of the law until we find the everlasting covenant. That's the problem. We couldn't find it. We could have read and studied it and tried to keep all of its rules and regulations and become fastidious about all of the things that are in the Old Testament, but that's not finding the book of the law. Finding the book of the law, because it says in Proverbs 13:14, the law of the wise is a fountain of life. You only have to look at Judaism to see that the law of Moses is not a fountain of life for them. I mean, where are all the promises? That all your enemies will be scattered and you'll be bountiful land? I mean, I don't think so. I don't think they're reaping all the rewards, and their temple is desecrated and they are having lots of problems. So they haven't found the book of the law as it should be. So this is one of the quotes on page 27 that really captured my attention. It's halfway down the page. The closing words of Malachi are a prophecy regarding the work that should be done preparatory to the first and the second advent of Christ. This prophecy is introduced with the admonition, remember ye the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb. Is this a prophecy for the second coming? Remember ye the law of Moses?
Yep.
And that was written in 1905. Again, this is post 1888, when these things are being written in the Southern Watchman. So, I want to come over to page 28. Again, the Ellen White quote. She's writing to Stephen Haskell. I have things to send to you in writing that I deem very important, and I think it will be prepared in a form so that many may be benefited by it. I should oft be so pleased to have talks with you upon matters that are intensely interesting to me. This is Ellen White writing to Stephen Haskell and his wife. That I'm trying to write out in reference to the specifications in scriptural injunctions in regard to the duties one to another in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. We must just call to our minds those precepts on actual practical missionary work and work intelligently and do the very principles of Christianity, the gospel of the Old Testament. And this some call the Dark Ages. If so, is it not because they had no communication from heaven?
Right.
See Leviticus 25. The Lord was over the whole earth. Every seventh year was a sabbatical year. This would be a wonderful arrangement down in this age of great light. So what is she suggesting here? The sabbatical principle, the 7th year, applying this. Not only the agricultural processes were to be intermitted, but the cultivation of the soil was not permitted. It lay in spontaneous growth for the benefit of the poor. All had free access to it, the strangers and the flocks and the herds. This was to invigorate the productive, worn-out soil, etc. And then she says, the land had a Sabbath, or yearly Sabbath. So again, she's intensely interested. She's saying we should be doing these things. It doesn't sound like something that's been nailed to the cross, does it? Then she says this, then the Jubilee, the 50th, the lessons given were to encourage liberality and overcome all stinginess, and to give lessons to all that it was the Lord's land. Is that a yoke of bondage? The Jubilee principle? I don't think so. And then the last paragraph. I cannot write out all that is contained in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, but I think our people in this enlightened age of 1899, I like that, if they would go back to the period they call the Dark Ages and bring into their practical life the lessons that Christ gave to the Hebrews, they would act out the obedience God requires of them. Their hearts would not be so full of selfish principles, and when his brethren working in hard fields should ask a favour, that they would close the door of their hearts and say no. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting that she's writing to Haskell about this in 1899.
Also, Hannah pointed out in 1905,
yeah,
it's March, just before Passover.
Ah, interesting.
1899, August, just before what's happening.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. August, before Tabernacles, or heading towards trumpets, just before trumpets, that this was occurring. So, this is a wonderful little booklet. There's a point in here that I wanted to mention. Bottom of page 29. This is the comment made here. Sadly, the failure in 1888 to understand the everlasting covenant in its proper context meant that the book of the law could not be placed in its correct framework, and thus it would be after her death that this book of the law would be truly found in the right framework. So, that's basically the thoughts in this booklet that I think helping to explain a number of things. And of course it's not only the festivals, but it certainly helps in that regard as to why and the resistance that we've had on this particular point has been very interesting. But I'm very encouraged by this, and I'm very thankful to Pastor Aarons and Danny Brown, who did a lot of the editing for it, that we can have this book available. Because I wanted to get those quotes talking about where Ellen White basically says we need to be keeping the law of Moses. That's basically what we need to be doing. But we need to do it in a way that is in harmony with the everlasting covenant, and so that we're actually finding the blessing in the book of the law. Any thoughts? Daniel's full of thoughts. All right. Shall we end it there? Let's have a prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for the statutes and the judgments. We thank you that seen through the lens of the life of Christ, that these things are a great blessing. I pray that you will continue to teach us your law and your ways as you intended these things to be kept and to be observed. That will bring great blessing to us, and that we will be able to share with our neighbours, our friends, family, the wonderful things that we're learning in your law. And as David spoke to his son Solomon, that these statutes and judgments will bring great blessing when understood in their proper framework. And I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.